Good morning. In our first lesson today, we hear the story of Moses' encounter with God. Moses turns aside because he sees the divine, an angel in a bush which burns and is not consumed. Moses opens himself up to the experience by turning aside from his normal path. He could have continued, but he was compelled, like a moth to a flame. And when he opens himself to this revelation, he hears a voice call to him and tell him, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place upon which you stand is holy ground." Now, the word in Hebrew that was used for the removing the sandals is a verb which has the same word as used as when an animal sheds its skin. So in essence, the original message was to shed your sandals, to remove that skin which you place upon yourself, which is what sandals were and are in those days, between you and the real world. Many people interpret this to mean that Moses mustn't profane the holy ground with his dirty shoes. Even today in Middle Eastern cultures, shoes are considered unclean. Remember that the pictures of the Iraqis after one of the Gulf Wars, hitting the statues of Saddam with their shoes, or the reporter who threw his shoes at then President Bush. Now, I like to look at this particular scene a little differently, though. Moses had been walking on holy ground for some time as he walks up to approach this bush. He just hadn't been able to notice. We build up all sorts of protections for against noticing the world. We insulate ourselves from the reality in the same way as we insulate our feet from the tacks and the stones and the things that we tread upon. We build up these protections in our lives, our clothing, our homes, our institutions. They protect us from the dangers of the wilderness. And where Moses had led his flock was beyond, into the wilderness, to that place where God dwells. God dwells in the wild, the untamed places of life. But if we want to experience the divine in those places where divinity exists, we must turn towards it and shed or remove those parts of our lives which keep us from experiencing it. Now, there are many ways of doing this shedding. If we were a contemplative order, we might try meditating. Some do. We also might try to do it through prayer. We might do it through good works, being of service, things which take us out of ourselves and out of our comfort zone. Because the wilderness is not the comfortable place. Things which compel us into the wilderness of those things which we could try to do. But as long as we cling to those ways of being safe, we won't see or experience the sacred ground that we're already walking on. Now, Jesus told his disciples about what was to come and that they needed to trust. He knew what was coming, and he needed to trust in the Lord, which is why he told Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. Don't make this harder for me. I'm going to have to go through and die. Don't make it harder by holding me back." If we want to follow Jesus, and as I said last week, Jesus never said worship me. He just asked us to follow him. If we want to follow Jesus, We need to deny ourselves, those things about ourselves which keep us from experiencing God. To take up the mantle of Christ, which is the cross, which is loving those who would do us ill, loving abundantly, forgiving to excess. These are the cross, the ways of being which got us all here. We need to give up the shoes and walk on holy ground. We need to give up those things of our society, the Gucci of the spirit, that are the stumbling blocks between us and the divine. Trying to hold on to the transitory, which are the things of this life, including our lives, will force us to make decisions out of fear. When we fear, we will lose, which means we will struggle against our neighbor rather than building them up, which means we will see limits to the amount of grace or the amount of plenty which is available to us all. We will always never have enough, and so we will make decisions about not having enough. Well, what can we do? We might not have enough. How will we get by? God asks us to take that step, to step into the Holy Land without our shoes. Now, Paul echoes this seeming paradise. Bless those who persecute you, and do not curse them. Now, how strange that sounds today when we have a lot of cursing of people going on all sides. And we have people who are talking about Christianity being persecuted in our country because we no longer pray in schools or do those other things that they think we should do. Well, Christians in Paul's day knew about persecution. In his day, Christian lives didn't matter. People had legitimate fear for espousing their beliefs. Paul was put to death by the Romans. We, though, as Paul admonishes us, are to feed our enemies, to give them drink, to extend hospitality to strangers, and not to fear for our lives. You know, these admonitions by Jesus and Paul were new for their day. You had nobody telling anybody you should love your enemies before Jesus came along. They said treat your neighbor as you would yourself. But no one was telling everybody to love abundantly. Love those who persecute you. They lived in a pre-Christian culture. They were a persecuted minority. And today, when Christians in the West and America especially, we're not a persecuted minority. But we still don't hear the message of Jesus and Paul heralded in the public square. People today will lobby to put up the Ten Commandments, the law of Moses, but not the commandment of Christ, to love one another. Nowhere do we see monuments saying, forgive 7 times 70 times. Nowhere do we see saying, live peaceably with all, as Paul writes. No one's carving that into the sides of our buildings. Our foundation is not inherently Christian, based upon what Paul and Jesus taught. And many contend it's based upon very secular principles, primarily looking out for number one. What, though, does it benefit us to be punitive and vengeful? There's that wonderful saying, and I don't know who first said it, but if you're going to seek vengeance, first dig 2 graves. one for the person you're going to seek vengeance for, and one for yourself. When we're so wrapped up in our lives of judgment, the judgment of others, we're never going to see that angel in the bush. I'm going to be too busy looking at you to see God. We won't turn away into the wilderness and hear the voice of the great I Am speaking to our hearts. We will lose our ability to be truly empathetic when we do that. Now, I believe that we'll come to judge ourselves truly at the end of our days. At some point, our self-delusions will be all stripped away. And we will answer truly, did we think of ourselves before others? Did we judge others? Did we seek revenge? Or were the coals of compassion heaped upon our heads by the righteous? Did we weep with those who mourned? Rejoice for the joy of others? Did we turn away the lowly and the unclean? For as we hear in today's scriptures, God hears the cries of those in bondage and will send them help. And it might be you that God sent. Who am I, God, to stand before Pharaoh? Who are we to question who God will choose? If we listen for the voices of the angels, the messengers of the divine, it need not come from the midst of a burning bush. God will show us that we've already been walking on holy ground, because all of creation is holy ground. All of our lives is holy, are holy. Jesus taught us how to see it. Paul taught us how to express and experience it. Shed the self, the baggage, the layers of culture and society. Shed them. The more we hold on to them, the more we lose ourselves. Let them go. We will open our temples when the floods come and never fear the thief that comes in with a storm. We will open the doors when the inferno spreads across the valley and walk upon the coals with bare feet. We will share with those who call us heretics, and there are many who do, because that's what Jesus asked us to do. We will forgive ourselves and those around us when we fail, because we will. And we will let grace fill our hearts. And we will love from our scarcity or our abundance, because we are Christians. We are Christians, don't you know? We have shed our shoes. We are sent to do the work of the great I Am, the consciousness that exists in all of creation, who sent his only Son so that we might know him. Her, it, we. We are to spread love throughout creation as our divine purpose. That is the cross of Christ. To do the impossible. To love without question. In God's name. Amen.